Cape Cod Broadcasting weaves the listening environments of 99.9 WQRC, Ocean 104.7, WFCC Classical 107.5, Cape Country 104, and CapeCon.com's website experience to reflect the lifestyles of the people who live, work, and play on Cape Cod. We hope that you enjoy this podcast.
I'm Laura Reckford, and this is Sunday Journal. We're focusing in this segment on a very serious issue here on the Cape and Islands and across the Commonwealth and even the country, opiate abuse and addiction in general. I'm here in the studio with John McGinnis, co-chairman of the Citizens United for a Drug-Free Environment, a new group started to help parents and friends of addicts to advocate for more treatment and prevention for those addicted to opiates and or other drugs and or alcohol. John McGinnis, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Laura.
Let's start by telling people how this new group came about.
Well, Tom Fagan and myself have been acquaintances since 1997 when we got involved in this Young Visionaries group, and it was actually focusing in on after-school activities for the kids, and it developed into this organization called Young Visionaries. But from there, it became we got a couple of grants, and it became part of our afternoon programming, in which Tom was more involved than I, because I was then a probation officer and had actually been a probation officer in the Superior Court, the trial court of the Commonwealth, for 32 years. So, but after that acquaintance, of course, we had spoken over the years. But one of the last, the poignant piece here is that Tom called me in late September, and I hadn't heard from him for about 6 months or so. I said, Tom, how you been? I haven't talked to you for a while. And he says, John, I've got some bad news. My son Isaiah passed away. And it struck me that the same way it struck when my own brother passed away. But in any event, I said, Tom, what happened? And he says, I went up to his room last night, and I thought he was in a prayer position, and I pushed him, and unfortunately he rolled over and he was blue and had passed away from an overdose. And it just, I think, reverberated not only through the Fagan household, but as the saying goes, for whom the bell tolls. I think it tolls for all of us, and this is a scourge. It's an insidious disease that has infected our community, and I think we're a microcosm of other communities across the country, unfortunately.
And then did the two of you decide that you might want to form this group to help perhaps other parents or people who knew addicts and to advocate for treatment and prevention?
Yes. Tom called me a couple of days subsequent to that and said, John, we've got to do something. My family is really in a very depressed state, and understandably so, and we're having a wake coming up and would like you to attend, and my wife Jackie as well. So, and after the wake and during the wake, actually, we started to formulate some ideas about some action to take, and I sort of indicated that we should focus in on treatment, because for 45 years, this so-called war on drugs has been a failure, and it's not a new idea that it's been a failure. This is something that the Global Commission got together in 2011, and there were such notables as the UN General of the UN got together with Paul Volcker, with Mr. Schultz, who was Secretary of the State under Reagan, and many other luminaries got together and decided that it was time to end a so-called war on drugs and start to focus in on treatment and start eliminating all the need for prisons and law enforcement factors. It was time to focus in on treatment, and combined with their idea, and the NAACP also indicated that it was time for a change and a time for some of the statistics that the NAACP mentioned was interesting, in that they said for 45 years we spent over $1 trillion yet drug use has increased 2,800%. And we've had 44 million arrests. There's a quote here that says on the NAACP that by now two things should be neon obvious where the drug war is concerned. The first is that it failed, and the second is that we should start to focus in on treatment rather than punitive measures, and that had been obvious for some time. So this was going to be the focus of our Citizens United for Drug-Free Environment, was to educate the public on how we were going to go about this treatment. I am a case manager at High Point Treatment Center.
That's very interesting, and you brought up how you had this long career in the courts, and now you're a counselor at High Point. So talk a little bit about your career and how you ended up getting into this counseling field.
Yeah. Well, it was strange how I got into the probation field, and that I was heading towards adjustment counseling and getting a further degree. I had a master's in education with concentration in psychology. So I was planning on getting a further degree in psychology and heading towards a job as an adjustment counselor when, in a 2-minute conversation, everything changed and I was heading into probation. But I always had an interest in impulse and what was this thing called impulse, why people didn't think before they acted. And that, of course, ended up in the neuroscience that I had no knowledge of at the time. And I, like many general public people, thought that it was just a matter of free will. This is just a matter of more discipline. And, in fact, it is something that takes their free will. Addiction takes their free will. Opiates take their free will. Heroin and all the other insidious drugs take the free will of the individual who become an addict. Nobody chooses to be an addict or an alcoholic. And so my interest then went from at High Point, I had always had an interest in, again, impulse, and impulse turned into symptoms of ADD, ADHD, and I always thought that was a cause for a lot of crime as well, was this impulse that people got involved in, and it was further diminished by alcohol or drugs. But I never thought about the neurobiology that's involved, and that sort of evolved and came to the forefront in the 90s as far as I was concerned. And
then you decided, after a long career, when some people might retire, you decide to then be a counselor at a local facility here. And so this is almost really a second career for you. It
is, but a continuation of my interest in this factor called impulse and how people lack forethought and the ability to think before they act.
I'm Laura Reckford, and this is Sunday Journal. I'm talking with John McGinnis, who has helped to found a new group that is advocating for changes in the way we deal with opiate abuse and addiction, and to advocate for putting money into treatment and prevention. And now the group's name, as we talked to briefly before the show, that the group is now called Citizens United for a Drug-Free Environment. That name might change, but it held its first meeting recently. How did that meeting go, and who attended?
Well, it went pretty well for the short time we advertised it, and we had a turnout of about 50 to 60 people. Most of them, of course, are from the splitted group. Another thing that we're trying to include are addicts themselves in our group, and we want the stigma to be erased. We understand clearly that it's a mental health issue, and what we have, in fact, what we're dealing with are patients, not inmates.
Now, if someone is interested in being in this group, what is a meeting like in this group? What are the types of people that might be interested in being a part of this group?
Well, we're hoping that we're going to focus in on interdependent, and this is the best way, is to understand that other people help us and we help others. And it's interdependence and a unified voice that is going to eventually take care of this scourge that is in our community now.
It's for family members of addicts, friends of addicts, and as you said, addicts themselves can attend. Is that basically what the group is set up for? Is it also for service providers like yourself, people who work with addicts? What is really the focus in terms of who you would like to attend the group?
Well, again, I hope to bring all together, and anybody with any kind of an idea on how to attack it, or if it's a dissenting idea, it will be heard as well. We had a gentleman who was an addict there, and he made a simple statement. He said that I was an addict, and I'm now in counseling, and I'm thinking about to become a counselor myself. But I feel that it's pretty simply put, is that we need longer term a longer term in treatment, and we also need an individual who is into the mode of self-improvement. So that's the key, and that's what we feel as a group is too. The key for treatment is longer-term treatment. As a case manager, I deal with people for 7 to 10 days, and we're supposed to transform their life in that short period of time and send them off in the right direction. Our feeling is that, and interesting enough, is that where it should start, and the leadership has already stood up in the court system, and the term in the person of the two past Supreme Judicial Court chiefs, or at least two of the past leaders that have stood up and wanted to help with substance abuse have been, and I recall that Judge Paul Liakos, who was a great leader, and in 1995, he got a commission together of court personnel and others and said, what is the negative impact on drugs and alcohol in our court system, not only the criminal side but the civil side? And the upshot of it was that 80 to 85% were negatively impacted. All the cases that came through the Commonwealth court system were negatively impacted by drugs or alcohol. So from there, I lost my attention on what he was doing and realized that it got dropped somewhere along the line. And this fact that he wanted to continue and pursue this finding in a positive way, and have the courts lead, have the courts be the leadership in changing the substance abuse, and at the time the neuroscience was just evolving into a place where it was becoming more and more important. And we're no longer looking at just observations of behaviors, but we were, through neuroscience, we were getting brain images and factual scientific information from places like the National Institute of Drug Abuse and from the American Society for Addiction Medicine. And finally, the American Society for Addiction Medicine came out in August of 2011 with a new definition stating that addiction is a chronic brain disease in which you lose your free will. Chronic means they're going to have it the rest of their life. This is something there's no cure. You have this the rest of your life, and that's your diagnosis, and you lose your free will. However, during the course of this time, they finally get sick and tired of being sick and tired, and they drop down into rehabilitation. And what happens in rehabilitation, I've been involved for the last 12 years, is that there's different phases of the rehabilitation. First is in detox, where they have 5 to 7 days, by the way, 5 to 7 days to detox, come down off of the drug of choice. And after that, they enter into what's called the clinical support services. And that's where it's 7 to 10 days. And 7 to 10 days, you're supposed to draw up a treatment plan as well as educate the addict and alcoholic on how to sustain sobriety, but you draw up a treatment plan and head them off in the right direction.
Now, it is a long process for addicts, and as you said, it's a lifelong process. Now, this is, of course, an emotional issue, as you mentioned at the beginning of the show. It's life and death for some families. Was the meeting emotional, and does the group serve as somewhat of a support group, or is it more focused on action items for legislators and that type of thing?
Well, it is both. It's a support group, and obviously the families that have been stricken and have the worst sacrifice in losing a child, and nobody should lose a child before themselves, So it is also an action group, and I hope, again, our focus is going to be on treatment. We've heard from various people in the short time that we've been we've been involved in this. We've heard from people all over the state now that want to be involved in the group and have a unified voice to finally rid the community of this, again, insidious disease. And it's a mental health issue. Clearly understand it's a mental health issue. It's not one of – it manifests itself, unfortunately, and it can get to the point of crime, but it is a mental health issue in which they lose their free will.
Do you see the group as doing its main work as perhaps writing letters to legislators, or will its main work be perhaps individually helping to steer parents to resources for children that may be addicts, or do you see the group going in a different direction, or are you really unsure as it's brand new?
Well, we're sort of unsure. Interesting enough, the recent new chief judge of the Supreme Judicial Court, Judge Gann, on October 16th, in his State of the Judiciary, mentioned again it's time to look at evidence-based, individualized evidence-based sentencing. In other words, his focus was going to be on including substance abuse in a way that it was a mitigating, as the attorneys would say. It's mitigating as opposed to being a guilty, automatic guilty. And if we're able to do this, and one of the senators mentioned that, why should we go to court for treatment? And in fact, that's where they surface most likely is in court. So that is the time to identify them, nip it at the bud, so we don't have 5, 6 OUIs. We don't have motor vehicle homicides. We can get it early. We identify them early. We have them evaluated as an addict or an alcoholic, and then we send them for long-term treatment. Long-term being, it's debatable what the minimum would be, 3 months, 6 months, but up to a year for treatment. And at that point, we would be able to turn and direct them in a proper way and hopefully would bring them into a point where their treatment would be a long-term behavior changes, new habits, in other words, that would sustain their sobriety and start to lessen or diminish the need for the drug.
Well, that's a good way to sum this up. Thank you, John, so much for being here today to talk about this important issue of addiction and what families can do.
Thank you, Laura, for having us, and I hope the fight will continue and it will be successful.
I'm Laura Reckford, and this is Sunday Journal.
This podcast is a presentation of Cape Cod Broadcasting, which is solely responsible for its content. Thank you for listening. For more information, please visit us at capecodbroadcasting.com.